So let's talk a little bit about what animation is and how we got to the animation we know today from its previous history. A good definition of animation is simply any method by which pictures are manipulated to appear as moving images. Now, we're used to thinking of animations as being frame by frame or picture by picture. But the truth is, if you took this definition of an animation, you could apply it to something as simple as shadowplay. And shadowplay has been around for thousands of years and can be found in nearly every culture. This is simply where you use your body or other objects to manipulate light and shadows onto a wall, and then your mind is interpreting what it's seeing based on those silhouettes. But the first animations that we would consider frame by frame or picture to picture started off as children's toys. Artists recognized that if you viewed changing images rapidly, you could get the illusion of lifelike movement. The phenakistoscope was a popular toy amongst Victorian-age children. To use it, you would hold it up to a mirror and look through a small hole at the very top of the disc. Now, this disc was attached to a handle that allowed you to freely spin it, and when you looked through the hole as it was spinning, the images that were on the disc would appear to be moved and animated. The Zoetrope was another popular toy at the time. It worked on the same principle of momentarily blocking your eye and showing you one image at a time to give you that illusion of animation. The advantage of the Zoetrope was that you could remove and replace different animations within the same toy. Now, these were very popular for a long time, but the obvious disadvantage was that you were limited in the amount of time, the amount of space, and detail that you could add to these kinds of animations. But the new invention of photography is what would bring animation into its modern era. Now, lots of photographers dabbled with animating their photographs, but the one that's best known for really refining the technique is Edward Muybridge. Muybridge was a British photographer who spent a lot of his time in California and the Yosemite Valley. While he was there, he was good friends with the governor, Leland Stanford. Now, Leland Stanford was a railroad tycoon, and he had the hobby of owning and breeding racehorses. Now, the story goes that between Leland and his friends, they had an outstanding debate about how a horse runs at full gallop. For centuries, artists had been depicting horses at full gallop with their feet off the ground stretched in front and behind them. But this action has always been so quick that no one could ever prove or disprove it. So the governor asked Edward Muybridge to try to solve this debate. To do this, he built a special racetrack that had a series of cameras connected to tripwires. As the horse ran across the cameras, it would trip the wire and photograph them at a particular slice of time. Once the photographs were developed, it conclusively settled the debate. He could clearly see by the second frame that a horse's feet do leave the ground. But in a twist, the feet don't stretch out in front of them and behind them. The horse's feet are off the ground and tucked underneath them. Now, the big leap came when Edward Muybridge wanted to give a lecture and show his process of how he got these results. To do this, he invented a way of putting his photographs onto a spinning disc that could be projected onto the wall, and he dubbed this the Zoetrope. These glass discs could be interchangeable, and these images could be shown to a large audience, something that the zooscope and phenakistoscope could never do. Now, after this, the next major leap in motion pictures comes from this guy, Thomas Edison. Edison's film company did two major things to bring film into its golden age. First, rather than having a small set of images repeating over and over again on a single disc, Edison's film company developed a technique of applying photographic chemicals to a thin film of cellophane. This film could be fed into a camera for recording the images, and then later, after processing, fed into a projector for displaying the images. This way, you could record images as long as you had enough film. But there's a problem. This new film was very expensive to produce, and so you want to be able to have enough film to create a convincing animation without having to add too much cost to its production. So the second thing that they figured out was how many frames were necessary to get a good, convincing animation. So let's test something out. I've recorded my daughter playing on her scooter. I'm going to play this back at different frame rates. As you watch these, try to determine which frame rate gives you the best lifelike motion. So here's her playing at 2 pictures or frames taken every second. Now obviously you're getting the illusion of movement, but it's not very lifelike. It's very jerky and doesn't look natural. Here it is at twice the frame rate, 4 pictures a second. Now it's much smoother, but still you can tell the gaps in between the moments in time. Let's double it again. Here's 8 frames. Again, much faster, but you can still tell that there's something about it that's missing in its lifelike movement. Going up again, here's 12 frames per second. Now we're starting to get into a more lifelike frame rate. Here it is at 16, and here it is at 24. Edison's company determined that 24 frames per second is the minimum rate your eyes need to perceive lifelike motion. Now, 24 frames is good, but let's compare this 24 frames with half the rate at 12. Most people who see an image at 12 frames per second, it actually looks good enough to be convincing and lifelike. 24 just goes extra and beyond to fully convince your brain. Now imagine if you're an animator and you have to draw off this scene, making 24 frames or 24 drawings just to give you 1 second of animation. That's going to be a very daunting task. This is why many animations animate every other frame, giving you 12 frames per second for the basic animation, even though it's played back at 24 frames per second. 12 being the minimum for most animations that were created. So why 24 frames per second and not any other number? Well, there's a variety of different reasons for this. First off, the math for 24 works out pretty well. If I need half of a second, all I need to do is divide 24 in half and it gives me 12 even frames. If I need a third of a second, that'll give me 8 even frames. Fourth of a second gives me 6 even frames. And so it works out really well to edit 24 frames per second than any other number. Also, if you know anything about music, whenever you want to time music, 24 beats per second tends to even out very well whenever playing the music along with whatever's being shown with it. Also, the internal mechanics of both the camera and the projector made it easier to engineer based on 24 frames versus any other number. Now, that's not to say you couldn't use a different frame rate. As a matter of fact, modern day televisions use between 30 and 32 frames per second, and some high definition television and films use all the way up to 60 frames per second. Now, if you're paying attention, I'm going to give you an opportunity for some bonus credit. If you will research and discover why a television has about 30 frames per second, email that information to me and I'll give you 10 extra bonus points on any assignment or exercise. Once film is established as a method of creating motion pictures, this ushers in a golden age of film. Entire theaters would open up, showing a variety of different short films that were usually cheaper to show than entire theater productions. So most of these films would cost about a single nickel per show. Oh, and by the way, the Greek word for a collection of theaters were the Odeons. So if you brought your nickels to the Odeons, you went to the Nickelodeon. So this was the common word that was used to describe the theaters that would show these short little films. And what films could you see? Why, you could see The Arrival of a Train at La Côte, or The Kiss by Edison Studios. Actually, this is one of the very first American-made films, and it was quite sensational. The story goes that at the time there was a Broadway play called The Widow Jones, and during this play there was an on-stage live kiss. Now this is during Victorian times, so for men to even hold hands in public was scandalous, let alone kiss someone they're not related to. But everyone wanted to see that kiss. It was the most famous part of the play. So Edison approached the producers and asked if he could film just that part of the play. Later on, this particular film became a sensation because it was shown throughout the entire country. Even as late as the 1930s, copies of these were shown as a short bonus before the main feature film. Now, animation was no stranger to feature films as well. One of the first recognized feature animations was created in 1908 by Emil Cole and his brother. You can view this film online and really get a sense of what early animated films were like. They're vastly different from the type of things that are created today simply because they lack some of the basic principles and techniques of animation that we're used to seeing. Now, the one person who's credited for bringing animation into the modern age is this guy, Walt Disney. And his first greatest creation that launched him to fame was, of course, that of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. You probably thought I was going to say Mickey Mouse, right? Well, before Disney invented Mickey Mouse, he worked for Universal Studios to develop a series of short animated films that featured this lucky rabbit. Now you can view many of these first animations online, and they're strikingly different from that of Phantasmagoria, even though they were created just 20 years later. A lot of the tools, techniques, and principles were starting to really coalesce and develop into what we consider good feature animation. Now, by the late 1920s, Disney started his own studio with his brother in his backyard, and they started to produce their own copyrighted material. Of course, Mickey Mouse being their first and greatest continuous hit. And for nearly 100 years, they've continued to push the boundaries of animation, having every one of their films introduce some sort of new principle or new technique that revolutionized the way animation is created. But just like with Edison perfecting the use of film, he didn't do this by himself. Disney employed some of the best animators and illustrators of their time. And collectively, these first animators are known as Disney's 9 Old Men. These are the guys that pioneered what we consider today the Disney animation style. And many of the animators that are working today are direct descendants of those who've worked under these original 9 men. Now, 2 of these animators, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, coalesced all that they've learned into a single book that is typically known as the Bible of Animation. This is the Illusion of Life. In this book, they detail out their 12 principles of animation, and these are the 12 principles that we're covering this semester. And from this writing, they've been able to influence animators, not only in their time, but in our time as well, across multiple countries and multiple cultures. So this is where we find ourselves today. Regardless if you're using traditional hand-drawn or digital computer animated animation, everything falls back on the historical developments of all of these people over the last 150 years.